The average person is outraged, and the average politician is trying to cover it up. Groups of Pakistani Asian men, many of them work at local takeaway shops or convenience stores, and they first come in, ply girls with alcohol, drugs, free taxi rides, and then progressively introduce them to the wider gang and will sexually exploit them.
Wild.
It isn't an issue that just started with Elon, and yet Elon seems to be the only person that has been able to make mainstream politicians actually pay attention. 5 years old when my abuse started. The experience of myself and the experience of countless other girls was that we were at fault for the abuse that we suffered. Every number that is being thrown around was to minimize the scale of abuse, because again, the people that are releasing the data are the same people who failed to protect those little girls. It has been allowed to happen for so long because those in power were too scared of being called racist. Keir Starmer himself branded every person who is speaking out about this essentially a far-right bandwagon jumper. There's no conspiracy because it's the truth. It's out there in the open.
Samantha Smith, welcome to my podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks very much for coming on and talking about this. I know this must be an incredibly stressful topic. It's stressful for me, and I'm just reading about it online. So before we get started, could you give a brief background about who you are and what it is you do and how you came to be immersed in this topic that we're about to discuss?
Yes, absolutely. So I was raised in Telford, in one of the epicenters of child sexual exploitation and grooming in England. There were three key areas in England that were, I suppose, most highly publicised when it comes to the grooming gang scandal, and that was Telford, Rotherham, Rochdale. I was raised in Telford for almost my entire life. I went to school there. I grew up there. I was in and out of um, local authority kids' homes as a teenager up until I turned 18. And I am now a political commentator and a political analyst. I write for the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, the Spectator. I didn't get started talking about my own experience in Telford and my story until about 2022, when the Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein story broke and was first in the news, at which point, obviously, again, growing up in Telford, I knew my own experience. I knew the stories of thousands of girls like me, and it felt as though a blind eye was being turned by the media, who were obsessing over this international high-profile case while ignoring a crisis in their own backyards. And so that was when I used my platform first to speak out and share my own story, and then have continued to do so for the past two and a bit years since.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's see. Let's start out talking about it because this has been wild on X in the last couple of weeks. I know you've been talking about it for years. I didn't come across any of this information until Elon kind of splashed it all over the news a couple of weeks ago. So can you just briefly explain what's going on now in the UK with the grooming gangs? I'm going to call them grooming gangs, I think, for this episode because I don't know what YouTube is going to flag if I just call them what they should probably be called. So maybe we can discuss that and see what happens. But can you describe what's going on in the UK now, how long this has been going on, just to give people on YouTube an idea of what's happening?
No, absolutely. And I know a lot of people, just on your point about calling them grooming gangs, I know a lot of people would prefer they were called something else. I think it's very important to make the distinction that they are grooming gangs, because this crime is so reliant on the grooming aspect. That's what makes these gangs so complex, so effective, so efficient, and so manipulative in their abuse and exploitation of little girls, is the way that they are able to draw them in and convince them that the abuse that they will go on to perpetrate is normal and is acceptable. And so and I know quite a few other survivors of grooming believe that grooming gangs are the correct term for it. So absolutely, I agree with you, and I'm happy to continue calling them that. When it comes to child sexual exploitation and particularly Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs in the UK, this is an issue that dates back to the 1970s in Britain, and has been investigated through a series of local reports and local inquiries as of the early to mid 2000s. It is still going on today. Little girls are still being groomed, manipulated, exploited, and abused, and even murdered by these gangs in towns like mine in Telford, Rochdale, Rotherham, Banbury, Birmingham, across the UK. It isn't centered in certain areas. Oldham isn't the first, nor is it the only town to have suffered this scandal, and it is characterized particularly by groups of Pakistani Asian men of predominantly Muslim religious affiliation working together across county lines or in within a local area. Many of them will be taxi drivers, many of them will work at local takeaway shops or convenience stores, and they first come in, ply girls with alcohol, drugs, free taxi rides, many of the girls being vulnerable, and then progressively introduce them to the wider gang and will sexually and criminally at times exploit them.
Okay, so I got exposed to this a couple weeks ago, like I said, because Elon was talking about it, and some of the court transcripts came out, and they're so awful. Uh, I can understand why people are talking about it now. I can't understand why it's been hidden for so long, but I couldn't get over how evil this is down to its core. And so I wanted to talk about it on YouTube to tell people what was going on because it's completely unacceptable. I also thought it would be helpful for people to know how these gangs go about grooming girls so that maybe parents, because if it isn't eliminated, it should be eliminated now, but if it's not, people should at least be aware of how this starts and how to potentially prevent it, or how to know that you're being targeted to be groomed. So can we get into that? Like, what's the pattern?
Absolutely.
What do these people do to kind of entice these girls or pressure them or whatever's happening? Is there a pattern that these people use?
Absolutely. And let me be clear. I don't know, like you said, what YouTube will flag. So please do let me know if I need to change up my language or anything like that. But um, it is still going on in Britain. It is still happening. I see it on council estates in my hometown. Other victims and survivors and those investigating this and who aren't turning a blind eye see it every day. We know that it's going on. Girls are coming forward that are as young as 13, 14 today, not in the 1980s, not in the early 2000s. Today, children today are coming forward and saying, I am being sexually exploited by Pakistani Muslim men. And that is a fact. That's an unavoidable fact. There is a pattern, there is a process, and a very clear methodology by which these gangs target young girls. Many victims of Pakistani grooming gangs will be between the ages of 11 and 15, although it can be older or younger. There are girls who were first targeted when they were 16, 17, and it is across age ranges. It's across social classes. Although again, the majority are white working class girls. There are cases where Asian girls or African origin British girls have also been targeted, but the most common victim is a white working class girl. And that's what we saw in Telford, Oldham, Rotherham, Rochdale. These men will target most of the time vulnerable girls who are already known to social services, who may be under local authority care, who have been abused before, whether that's by a family member or a trusted adult, who already have blurred boundaries and a weaker understanding of what is okay for adults to do to them. Myself, for example, I was abused from the age of 6, and that set up my grooming later on in life as a teenager because I didn't understand that the abuse that I had suffered wasn't normal and wasn't okay. I had been taught that these men had a right to my body in a way that no adult man ever should over a child. And so they target the most vulnerable girls in society, and they whether it's offering them money or drugs or alcohol or food or just love and attention. The boyfriend model was a very popular one in Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs, for example, where the girls would refer to their abusers as their boyfriend. They would say, well, I've got these boyfriends, they take care of me, they do these things, and it's okay because they're my boyfriend. But that isn't the only way that this happens. It can be men who, as I said, take advantage of vulnerability, who feed them, clothe them, take them places, and groom them, which is why they're called grooming gangs and why I'm so firm on referring to them as grooming gangs, because they groom young girls, they draw them in, they make them feel safe and wanted and loved, and as though they can trust these men, and then that's when they introduce them to the sexual abuse. It often starts with just the main abuser, the ringleader, or one member of the cell, and they will sexually abuse them, rape them, and then introduce them to their friends or their family members, their uncles, their dads, and say, well, you have to do this for my dad or my uncle as well, because you did it for me, or you know, he's going to pay you for this, or you know, I expect you to do this, otherwise I'm going to break up with you, or I'm going to harm your family, or whatever it is that they can leverage at that point, once victims are under their control and scared of them, and fear losing them, or fear what they might do to them if they do try and leave. That's when the wider group-based abuse starts. And that's how, again, girls for long periods of time are able to be abused by multiple offenders, because it balloons, it expands, it comes from one person in a small circle into 10, 20, 30 men, endless perpetrators who all have the same approach to the victim, and who all can leverage that same control and abuse that vulnerability.
So how come this has gone on for so long? Like if this happens to one person, say a working class girl in one of these smaller towns, and they go to the police, what has been happening when they go to the police?
Well, the experience in my case, and this is echoed across the board when it comes to victims and survivors, is that those in power turned a blind eye. I, for example, when I first spoke out about my abuse, I told one of my key workers at the kids' home that I was living in, and she had a mandatory reporting duty and passed it on to the police. I had a detective come round to where I was, and question me from the CSE team, the child sexual exploitation team. And one of her first questions that she asked me was whether I consented to sex at any time. And bear in mind, I was 5 years old when my abuse started. A child cannot consent under any terms to sexual activity. And yet, the experience of myself and the experience of countless other girls was that somehow, in some way, those in power and in authority believed that we were at fault for the abuse that we suffered, that in some way we were active participants, or that we brought it on ourselves, that it was a lifestyle choice. This is what was echoed in the Telford report in particular, and in Rotherham and Rochdale, the other two towns who had independent inquiries into child sexual exploitation. It was seen that, to quote the Telford report directly, that police had failed in their most basic duty to prevent girls being abused, and that this was due to a mixture of incompetence, ignorance, an attitude towards the victims, that they were somehow responsible for their abuse. So girls were often labeled as child prostitutes, and in fact arrested and charged at times for prostitution, when in reality they were being abused and raped on a nightly basis by adult Pakistani Muslim men against their will. They were called, I don't, you can bleep this out obviously if it's not, if it will get flagged by YouTube, but they were called white slags and Paki shaggers, and told that essentially there was no case to answer because they must have consented, that it was their fault, that they were troublemakers, and that it was a lifestyle choice. And so continually when girls were speaking out, and this is another key point, it isn't as if victims weren't coming forward, because victims were. Victims and their parents would bang down the doors of police stations, go to sexual health clinics, track down the perpetrators, hand in lists of abusers, and police and local authorities and key workers would take no action. They were aware of the abusers, they were aware of what was going on, but they simply did not care nor believe that the girls were deserving of the support and protection that they owed them.
Just insane. Just insane. And and then so there are numbers being thrown around about how many people this has happened to, and I know it's gone, like, depending on who you ask, it's like in the thousands and then 250,000 has been tossed around. What do you think? Like, what numbers do you think are reasonable for how many people this has happened to?
There's no reasonable number in my opinion, and this is
Oh,
partly by design.
absolutely
I think,
not.
yeah, I think that every number that is being thrown around has it previously was to minimize and try and reduce the scale of abuse and downplay it by local authorities. Because again, the people that are releasing the data are the same people who failed to protect those little girls. Child sexual exploitation and grooming gang statistics aren't separately recorded in national databases and by the police or by the Office for National Statistics,
Wow.
and that's by design. It's entirely intentional because if they can't hide from the numbers, they'll suppress them instead. And so everything is amalgamated under the umbrella of child sexual abuse, which includes every kind of abuse, whether it's abuse from a family member, priests abusing children, anything, any kind of sexual abuse in the UK is all bandied under the same general figure. We don't have a statistical breakdown of the different kinds of abuse. We have it by age range, we have it by ethnicity for child sexual abuse, but nothing when it comes to child sexual exploitation in particular and grooming gangs based sexual abuse. So whether it's 1,000 or 100,000 girls, we have no way of knowing. The only thing that I can speak from is my own experience. And I will say that in Telford, I don't know a single person that has lived in Telford for the majority of their lives that doesn't know a girl who was abused by Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs, who was victimized by child sexual exploitation, who was raped and exploited and threatened and manipulated and even killed by these men. It is a cautionary tale and something that was used as a don't be like them. You know what happened to them. Be better. Don't fall into the same trap as them. And yet, again, it was never the girl's fault. We all know someone that experienced it or experienced it ourselves, and no figure could ever truly capture the level of and scale of abuse and the impact of this on communities like mine.
Well, it's absolutely ridiculous for full adults to be suggesting that somebody who's even 14, even the numbers like 16 and 17, those are still young people. Like, I think anybody reasonable who thinks about themselves at 16 or 17 is like, yeah, I was naive and I was a kid, for a while. But then when you see these numbers that are like 10, 11, 12, well, I can't believe that anybody who went through that, who went to an adult, I don't understand what frame of mind the adult could be in to say, well, did you consent? It's like your brain isn't even fully developed yet for a while. Like, how can you even bring up the idea of consenting? It's so infuriating. It's unbelievable.
Absolutely. And it's also worth saying that in the UK, a child is any person under the age of 18, even though the age of consent is 16 in the UK, under the Children's Act 1996 and per the Sexual Offences Act, it is under 18 that still counts as a child. So whether you're 16 or 17 getting raped by an adult, you are still a child. There might be a legal age of consent, but you are still classified as a child and vulnerable, and it determines that you require prioritized protection and enhanced protection because there is an understanding under the law in England that you are still not adult enough, not mature enough, not developed enough to be able to be making adult decisions or to be subjected to adult acts. And so
Yeah.
even a 16, 17-year-old, there is no excuse for police, local authorities, social workers, sexual health clinic workers to be saying that you consented to this, you deserved this, you brought this on yourself. Under no circumstances is a child ever responsible for the abuse that they suffered, and yet that's what we were made to feel.
Yeah. Bringing age into it is worse. Like, this happening to young people is worse. But even people who are over the age of 18, if this happened to, it's still unacceptable. Like, it's not like it would be okay as soon as you hit 18. Nothing about any of it is even remotely okay. We should talk about, so since Elon kind of blew it up, what has the UK's response been like? I know that there was just a vote for a national inquiry, so we can talk about how that went. So I guess let's start with, from what are you seeing? Is anything happening in the UK on the ground, or are people talking about it more, saying like, thank goodness people are talking about it? Like, what's the average person's response to this?
The average person's outraged, and the average politician is trying to cover it up. That's what it comes down to, I think.
Yeah.
In the UK, there has always been an outcry of public outrage when it comes to child sexual exploitation. And the people that have seen it with their own eyes or experienced it have been speaking out for years. It isn't an issue that just started with Elon, and yet Elon seems to be the only person that has been able to make mainstream politicians actually pay attention and pull their fingers out on this issue. Because, like you said, on the ground, everybody believes that this is abhorrent. Everybody believes that this should have had more decisive action taken decades ago, and that it shouldn't still be going on. But those in power, those in positions of power, even after the groundswelling of international scrutiny and media coverage that followed Elon's picking up of the cases and of the scandal, they've done nothing but try and cover it up. The vote in the Commons the other day, the parliamentary vote, failed. It was defeated by the Labour Party, who, may I add, are the party who rule in most of the local authorities where child sexual exploitation was rife and is rife. Telford is a Labour-led council. Rotherham and Rochdale, both Labour-run. Oldham, Labour-run. Every major city or town that has been affected by child sexual exploitation has Labour politicians in charge. And Keir Starmer himself branded every person who is speaking out about this essentially a far right bandwagon jumper. So yes, the public believes in this. Yes, the public wants action, but I've seen nothing of note from politicians. And the Labour Party, in fact, have gone even further in closing ranks around those who could potentially be held responsible for the failings, and are continuing to blame the victims, blame the whistleblowers, try and deny, silence, avoid, and shift the blame onto everyone but themselves. We've seen a couple of outliers come out and say that we should have a national inquiry, but for example, the Rotherham and Rochdale MPs have both said that they would now support a limited inquiry into child exploitation, which, by the way, I personally believe they're only saying to cover their own necks in their constituencies, because imagine being the MP for that area and voting against a national inquiry into the biggest scandal and the biggest injustice that young girls in their area faced. And yet those same MPs voted against a national inquiry in Parliament the other day. So the action, I think, has been very performative, that which has been taken, and the majority of politicians have taken no action at all, or in fact have tried to block the cause even more.
Yeah, ridiculous. I think for people listening who aren't aware, the Labour Party they had more liberal values. If you wanted to compare it to the
Yes.
US, they had more liberal values than conservative parties. It's like kind of the equivalent in the UK. And they just had a vote. And what were the numbers? I couldn't believe the numbers. It was like something like, you might know them, but
It was
311.
it was 364 MPs that voted against a national inquiry into child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs, and 111 MPs that voted in favour of it. Not a single Labour MP broke ranks to vote for a national inquiry. And the
That's
entirety of the Labour
so
Party and the
crazy.
Liberal Democrats
Say,
voted to block it.
Yeah, that's so crazy. Has anyone come out with any excuses? Like, we were voting against it because, is it just that it's a right-wing conspiracy? Like, what's the excuse for voting against an inquiry into child sexual abuse? Like, what's their excuse?
There's been a whole host of excuses. The major one that MPs have said is that because it was an amendment on an existing bill, so the vote was tallied on by the Conservative Party leader as an amendment to the schools bill, I believe it was, saying that a national inquiry into grooming gangs should be held, and they were saying that if the amendment passed, then it would kill the bill and reduce protection for vulnerable children, which is absolutely ridiculous, in my opinion, saying that they want to protect vulnerable children and that's why they want to vote against this, while actively turning their backs on victims and survivors of child sexual exploitation, is beyond the pale. It's laughable that they're trying to take the moral high ground. That is the major one, is that if they voted in favor of this amendment, then the bill would be killed, and that it would slow down the process of essentially shutting down academies and bringing them back under the state school system. That was the main one that most Labour MPs quoted. Others said that a national inquiry wasn't necessary, that local inquiries are sufficient, for such as in Telford, Rotherham and Rochdale. And yet Telford, Rotherham and Rochdale all also requested national inquiries prior to being told, no, you have to do it yourselves, and being shut down by the previous Conservative government. Other MPs said that it was a politicised attack on the Labour Party and that it was the far right that had hijacked the cause. That was what Keir Starmer himself said, by the way. The leader of the Labour Party, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, did a public press conference and called those speaking out about child sexual exploitation members of the far right. There was a complete and total disregard for the victims and survivors, and an attempt to essentially brand all those who talk out about it right-wing Islamophobes.
Yeah. Did you hear about this MP? I just saw this floating around on X. Ivor Kaplan, who was a former MP who was kicked out. If anyone listening, this is so disturbing. So he was a former MP. He was kicked out.
Not just a former MP, a former minister. He was a member of the government. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. He was kicked out last year or something like that. If you go to his X, he has full on porn on his X.
About 90% of it is gay porn, 10% of it is him backing up Keir Starmer. Yes. It's some of the most disturbing footage I've seen.
And it's full on there, and there are other members of the Labour Party that are following him. It gets me pretty conspiratorial. Like, why would people vote against looking into child sexual exploitation? And then you see this guy and it's like, is that what the Labour Party kind of looks like? Like, and the dark side of it?
It's worth mentioning Ivor Kaplan, the MP, the former MP and former minister that you're talking about. He was on national TV just last week attacking those who were speaking out about child sexual exploitation and saying that he didn't support a national inquiry and that it was far-right agitators who were attempting to thwart the Labour government by bringing this issue up. And a week later, just a couple of days ago, he was arrested during a paedophile sting for allegedly trying to meet up with a 15-year-old for sex and sending indecent images to said child. He's sitting in jail right now on child sex abuse charges.
Which is why his X posts are still available. It's insane. You can't make it up. Like, I don't know. There's like trigger warning for anyone who's going to go look at that because there's actual porn on his X. But it's like, so that's the guy who was saying don't look into pedophilia. Okay.
That's the guy that was followed by high-ranking Labour ministers and officials. That's the man who is representative of the Labour Party and was supported by them and kept within their ranks until I believe it was June 2024. He was a member of the Labour Party and was a high-ranking official and continued to have involvement with Labour politicians past his suspension.
It's so disturbing. It's like, it sounds, if you didn't want to think people had the capacity to commit evil, you'd think it was a conspiracy, and then it's so blatant. It's such a blatant example of what's going on right there. It's really horrifying. Okay,
I don't believe that it's a conspiracy. I believe it's true. You can't hide from the facts.
Me too.
There's no conspiracy because it is a documented cover-up. The attitude of Labour authorities, local councils, politicians, the police, service workers, social workers, sexual health clinic workers, teachers, it was a cover-up, an orchestrated cover-up for decades, and it's continuing to this day. So there's no conspiracy because it's the truth. It's out there in the open.
Are these people, do you think, involved in the cover-up? So I know that there was the argument, like, we can't talk about who's committing these crimes because that would be Islamophobic. That was a huge cover-up. And now there seems to be a like pedophilia element to it. So are these people, I'm just wondering who these people are. I don't understand how there can be so many people involved in a cover up to this scale. Like you said, police, members of parliament, the prime minister isn't even looking into it. Is like, how deep does this go?
Well, in Greater Manchester, for example, there were serving police officers that were charged with being associated with the Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs, who were charged with child sexual abuse crimes and were active serving police officers at the time. There are members of local government and current MPs who played a part in the cover up of this scandal. The Telford MP, Sean Davis, for example, was a previous council leader. He was the leader of Telford and Wrekin Council from 2015 until 2024 and was a member of the Labour cabinet from 2011. This was during, as I said, I suppose the height of the investigations into CSE in Telford, and he and his council continued to deny responsibility for the failings. He himself was silent on the day that the Telford report was published, and he said at one point that he was 3 years old at the time that CSE was going on. Well, that's not true because I'm in my early 20s and CSE was going on and still is going on in Telford. He is a member of Parliament right now. He's a Labour MP, a sitting Labour MP, despite his failings and despite his role in the child sexual abuse and exploitation scandal in Telford. His members of his cabinet, for example, said the children and young people cabinet member in Telford at the time said that the journalist who broke the story on Telford was making it up to be able to sell a survivor's book, and that another senior Labour politician at the time in Telford said that the numbers were made up on the back of a fag packet. These are politicians who are still in post in Telford or in other areas. Some of them have moved to other local authorities. We have the former leader of the council, who's now a sitting MP, and by the way, was absent for the vote, didn't vote at all. He was missing in action in Parliament that day. The Telford MP didn't vote at all on whether there should be a national inquiry when Telford is thought to be the highest, is thought to have the highest victim count of any local area. So yes, there was involvement at all levels, and there continues to be. It pervades all the way up into Parliament.
Yeah, crazy. I guess it would make sense that evil people would get into the government to try and protect themselves, so they have power, so people don't look into what they're doing. So I guess on that level, it makes sense. Oh my gosh. Okay, so what should people, now that they've just, if if the Labour Party is a problem and they're not going to look into this, when is the next election in the UK? Is this, I guess, for lack of a better word, evil so entrenched that there's going to be able to be a switch in government so people look into it? Like, where do people go from here?
Unfortunately, the Labour Party commands the largest parliamentary majority, I believe, in history. It's one of the largest parliamentary majorities ever. And the next general election won't happen until at least 2029. So
Oh my gosh. Okay, when did
we've
they
got
get put? So
five
did they just
years.
get put in power?
Just got put in power. It's been, I
Okay.
believe, less than 150 days since they were in power, since they were elected into office. It was the Conservatives that were in power previously, and they have an entire parliamentary term to serve, which is, I think, says a lot considering how hated the Labour government is already. 6 months into their term, they've managed to crash the economy, vote against an inquiry into child sexual exploitation. They also took away heating payments for vulnerable pensioners this winter, by the way. That was another scandal. They locked up 73-year-old pensioners for tweeting about the Southport riots. This is 6 months of a Labour government. We've got 4.5 years left of it. And the only way that a vote would be able to be called a new general election was if MPs voted for it. And when there are 300 odd Labour MPs in Parliament and only about 140 or 170 non-Labour MPs, the chances of that happening are slim to none.
This is bad. Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, like I
That's
don't
not
know if
good.
you saw, there was a public petition for a general election that had I believe it reached over 3 million signatures of British residents who put in a public petition to Parliament saying that there should be a general election called, and it was debated in Parliament for about 5 minutes, in which time they said not going to happen, move on, and that issue was dead. Even though 3 million people said that it should happen, and we all knew that that was the case. We knew that a public petition wouldn't do anything, but it was more symbolic than anything to show the level of discontent and anger at the Labour regime.
This is a tricky situation.
Mm.
After like reading details into these cases a couple weeks ago, I was like, why aren't people? I get it, but at what point are people going to take to the streets? Like, really? It's because, like, how far does your government have to push you before there's some sort of uprising? Now, in Canada, this isn't associated to like child sexual exploitation, which is far worse. But in Canada, there were,
I mean, the trucker
like
protests.
there was the trucker protest, which actually garnered, that it garnered negative attention, but it also garnered positive attention. So people did end up taking to the streets, but like, I don't know what else there is to do at this point. I'm concerned that if people don't keep talking about it, it's just going to be like something that comes up and then something else bad is going to happen somewhere else. And people are slowly going to forget about it. And then all these like girls in Britain are going to be stuck in this situation. And like people aren't going to know what to do.
I mean, I've been speaking out about it for about 2.5 years. Many other victims and survivors have been speaking out about it for 10 or 20 years. And we've seen the news cycles forget about child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs time and time again. I couldn't count on two hands the number of times that it's hit national headlines. People have said, oh, we need to do better. We need to take action and get justice for victims. And then the 24-hour news cycle ends and people move on to the next political crisis. And we're already seeing that in the UK right now. Politicians are moving on and focusing on other things because it isn't the hot topic anymore. And the press is starting to die down. The other fear, when you said about taking to the streets, people have taken to the streets before. They took to the streets after the Southport murders. I don't know whether you heard much about that, but three.
No, can you describe that?
Yeah, so this was a few months ago. This was right at the start of Keir Starmer's time in office. Three little girls.
Are you trying to think of another word for rain?
Yes, yeah. He is ruling like a dictator, and I'm trying to keep my language professional, but he deserves very little respect in my opinion. Right at the start of his term, three little girls in a town called Southport were murdered by a domestic terrorist, a man called Axel Rucker Banda. I can't pronounce his surname, but he opened fire on a little girl's dance class, on a child's dance class in Southport, and three little girls were murdered. And the ensuing uproar as a result of that led to nationwide protests because it was seen that there was a cover up and that the influx of illegal migration had a hand in the increasing radicalization, because this is suspected to be an Islamic terrorist attack. So a lone perpetrator committing an act of terror on British soil and murdering three little girls, opening fire in a kids' dance class to wage a holy war. And his actions, and then in the ensuing media coverage, where they, for example, only published photos of him as an 11-year-old boy and talked about how he was an aspiring West End star and a shy schoolboy, trying to paint him as a sympathetic victim when he, again, was arrested on charges of murdering three little girls, led to nationwide riots. And as a result of that, there were hundreds of arrests. People were arrested for posting things on social media on X. People were arrested for taking to the streets and protesting against illegal migration in Britain. There are people who have already, they set up 24-hour courts to deal with this. Bear in mind, at a time when Keir Starmer is currently releasing sexual offenders and violent offenders with sentences of less than 2 years onto our streets because of prison overcrowding, he's sending pensioners to prison for 2 years for social media posts. That was the Southport riots. That was the last instance of public demonstrations, and that's what happened to those protesters. And so the fear right now, I absolutely believe is retribution from the government and from police and from local authorities. That again, the very same people who failed little girls in towns like mine will punish those who try to speak out. I myself had the police show up at my door when I went on national TV to speak about grooming gangs, and when I said that it was still going on in Telford and in towns across the UK, and when I said that police were still turning a blind eye, the very next day, West Mercia police showed up at my doorstep and tried to demand that I go down to the police station with them for an interview because, quote unquote, when you go on TV to talk about grooming gangs, you should expect to hear from us. They tried to threaten me and intimidate me into silence and try to penalize me for exposing their failings. Another survivor, Sammy Woodhouse, just the other day, about I think 4 or 5 days ago, had a call from South Yorkshire Police saying that she had to remove Twitter posts speaking about her story, her life experience as a victim of Pakistani Muslim child sexual exploitation, because it was going to jeopardize a case and she could potentially be held in contempt of court, and that she was at fault for tweeting about it publicly and sharing publicly available information that had been reported on the BBC and national news. They target survivors, they target whistleblowers, they target anyone who dares to go against the established narrative. And so that's why people aren't taking to the streets, I believe, because the rule of the
Yeah.
law that's supposed to protect vulnerable children is instead going to punish them and penalize them and throw them in prison for 2 years for speaking about it on X.
That's so crazy that that's where, like,
Yeah.
that's the state of things right now. It's so crazy. So I get that. So what would happen, do you think, in the UK if there was something like the trucker convoy, which was largely a peaceful, like, show up with trucks, there are people there, everyone was pretty chill. Like, there wasn't a lot going on. They were just like, hey, we're here. You have to change things. You know, is this what the rallies looked like on your side of the pond?
Many of them were, some of them weren't. So there were a lot of arrests, and I absolutely don't condone the violent protests that occurred after the Southport attacks. But again, it was painted by Keir Starmer and by the Labour regime as far-right agitators and far-right extremists and bigots who were taking to the streets and looting and burning down buildings and
Yeah,
committing
okay.
Islamophobic attacks, when the majority of those that spoke out and that protested were entirely peaceful and did nothing wrong and were simply voicing their concerns, their very legitimate concerns about the state of illegal migration in Britain. That was the case in the Southport riots, and even now, free speech, I don't believe exists in Britain. You can't speak freely about anything that goes against the mainstream quota because you will be targeted. I went on national TV, spoke about it in an entirely peaceful way. I think we can agree that that is a perfectly acceptable forum to speak about this, especially in my role as a
Yeah.
journalist. And I was targeted. I was contacted by police and they tried to intimidate me into silence. So no matter what you do, no matter how legitimate your concerns are, no matter how properly you follow the processes, those in power don't care about the processes. All they care about is covering up their own failings and continuing to silence those who could expose them.
So then what do you do in a situation like that? Do people ask for, like, Elon was like, we need international pressure, basically, at this point, because you can't get help if you're on the inside, which
Yep.
I understand. Like I said before, when do people take to the streets? But if you're getting arrested for social media posts, it's just such a crazy position to be in. And I think part of the reason, other than the fact that it's so evil that it needs to be exposed, so that's why I wanted to talk about it, and because it's really upsetting that can happen, just in general. But Canada and the UK are, kind of close, right? It's like
Definitely.
half combined with America and the UK or something is where
Yeah.
Canada is.
There's a
But
lot
it
of
was like,
crossover. And a lot
there's
of
a lot
the,
of
the
crossover.
Canadian laws are based off English common law as well. So it's a very similar governmental structure and way of operating, especially under Trudeau. I think Trudeau's
Yeah.
um, leadership, if you can call it that, and Keir Starmer, there's many parallels in a very bad way.
Yeah. So part of the reason to talk about it, other than the UK needs help, terribly needs help, is how do we make sure this stops? Like, I know Bill C-63, which is on pause right now because of this whole Trudeau's going to resign thing that's happening in Canada. That was similar to what happened in the UK,
Mm.
which it was going to allow people to be arrested for social media posts, which sounds so crazy to the average American. It's like, how could that even happen? But there really isn't like freedom of speech built in to the
No,
country like there is in the US. It was like, this could spread. Like, this isn't something, unfortunately, the UK is an example right now, but it's not special, you know?
no,
It could spread. So people need
no.
to know what to look for and to make sure it doesn't happen and to not be naive and to say, absolutely not.
Absolutely. This is a left-wing agenda for sure. And it might sound like I have my tinfoil hat on, but I've seen this in action in Britain for years. One of the big issues on free speech at the moment that's being debated is whether there should be an updated version of Islamophobia in the Equality Act, and whether Islamophobia should be specifically defined in law as anyone essentially who speaks out or criticizes Islam in any way, that they can be subject to hate speech crimes, and that they could be prosecuted under English law. That is being debated at the moment, and Keir Starmer has stated previously that he would be in favor of updating the definition to essentially introduce blasphemy laws on Islam. No other religion, just Islam. So it is accelerated in Britain. It is happening quicker than it's happening in Canada or in the US or in Australia and New Zealand, but it's happening across the globe. It's just that Britain is I suppose the cautionary tale for other governments and other countries of what can happen when this sort of legislation is allowed to pass uncontested, and when those in power don't have the courage or conviction to stand up for the rights of their people.
I think it's extremely naive as well for a number of reasons. But if you look at places like the UAE, for example, they've identified a lot of extremist groups
Mm.
and don't stand for it, right? They're like, absolutely not here, and that's a Muslim area too. And they're picky with who's allowed. Like, don't allow the extremist, horrible, evil people to be around our citizens.
And so instead, they
The
all come to
fact that
Britain and Europe.
they leave. They're like, you can't be here, kick them out. And then they all go to Western places where they're just like, you're all welcome. You can acclimate into society, when they've literally been kicked out.
There was a case that was in the news recently in Britain of an asylum seeker from the Middle East who came across to Greece first and successfully applied for asylum in Greece as his first port of call. He was granted asylum in Greece and it obviously indefinite leave to remain, and then he decided to leave Greece and cross the channel illegally and come to Britain because he knew that he would get a better deal. He knew, and I quote, that the benefits would be better and that the quality of life was better in England and that the government would give him more if he came to Britain illegally. And so he left a safe country where he had claimed asylum and been granted it to come to Britain because he knew that it was easier and that he would get more. He would be able to leech off of the state more. And that is a case that's repeated in the tens of thousands. I believe it was hundreds of thousands of illegal migrants that came into Britain last year alone. Um, and it's happening year on year. The numbers are growing. It's population displacement at its core. Bradford, for example, there's a postcode in Bradford. I can't remember the exact area, but there is an area in Bradford where 72%, I think is the exact figure, of citizens living there arrived in Britain after 2011. That is not British born. They are not British citizens by birth. These are people who have come into the country and are creating microcosms of their own home countries in our nation, and are being allowed to establish these epicenters where there is very little English communication. The level of integration with the rest of society is minimal. They don't like to associate with British people and with white people. They resent them, in fact, and are establishing their own microcosms of the Muslim ideal. And again, I will probably be branded a right-wing extremist and a bigot for saying this, but the numbers don't lie. The figures don't lie. The figures that we do have are very clear on this issue. And there are many places in the UK where this just is rife and it's continuing to grow.
So one thing I've been thinking about, I guess, in the last couple of weeks after learning about all this is how much of this is illegal immigration, how much of this is because we've never really had societies where we've incorporated really different parts of the world together and just been like, oh, everything's going to be hunky dory. What can we do to make sure we're not repeating this in Canada and America and Australia? Obviously, illegal immigration is a problem, but I was thinking, and this is my perspective, so I want to know what yours is these areas that are more prone to extremism, which seems to be occurring, especially in specific areas in the Middle East, where certain aspects of Islam can be just go really awry, right? For lack of a better explanation, is wouldn't it be simple for the government just to say, hey, people who are coming from this area, let's do a little bit more research? Like when people are immigrating to UAE, they look at your social media. They kind of like look and see who you are. And I don't think people who are, and maybe I'm being naive, but I don't think people who are extremists are not really outward with that perspective. Like you can go on people's X accounts and they tell you what they think. They're not hiding it and pretending to be like you because they full on disagree with how you live, what your society looks like, and they'll tell you it's wrong and that they want it to change. And maybe don't let those people in.
Yep. And this is why so many of them come illegally and cross the channel in Britain, because if you're coming via plane and you're crossing the border legally, you have to give them your name, you have to give them your passport, you have to tell them who you are. Whereas if you come over on a dinghy and cross the channel, you don't have to give any of that. You can give any name, any age. There have been countless cases where adult men have claimed that they were teenagers with a completely different date of birth and country of origin to hide the fact that they had criminal records in their home countries and that they, under no circumstances, would be allowed in the country otherwise. And we do have terrorism prevention organizations and schemes. We have the Prevent scheme in Britain, where those who are seen as being at risk of radicalization and extremism in Britain are reported and monitored by national authorities. But again, it doesn't work. It doesn't operate because they are hiding in plain sight. The Southport killer, who's currently on trial, he was known to Prevent before he committed his crimes. He was already on national radars for radicalization and extremism, and yet he was able to carry out his crimes without any efforts to prevent them. It is completely naive to assume that the government in any country, whether it's Canada or the UK or even the US, has any real understanding of who is crossing their borders. In Britain, we have no idea who the hundreds of thousands of predominantly adult men are crossing into our country every day. It was found that 10% of the male adult population of Albania currently lives in the UK. And Albania had to
Wow.
declare itself a Albania had to be declared a safe country by the UK government because so many Albanian men of working age, of fighting age, were coming into Britain illegally and then claiming asylum because they were saying that Albania was an unsafe country. And so the previous Conservative government, with much opposition from Labour, declared Albania a safe country so that they were no longer able to do that. But 10% of the current adult male population of Albania is residing in Britain.
That's insane. Okay. So then what's the solution here? Is the solution just, I mean, stronger borders, obviously. Is that the main solution? And
Stronger borders
deport
and
people.
deporting all foreign criminals. Again, the
Yeah.
Labour
Yeah.
government dismantled the previous Conservative government's plan and tried to block it at every turn when the Conservatives were in government to deport foreign criminals to Rwanda. It's a scheme, it's not something that is unique to Britain. Other foreign nations had deported criminals to different countries before or had stored them on floating container ships. There was a barge that was used by the British government that had previously been used by Germany, by I believe a couple of Scandinavian countries, to house illegal migrants while they were being processed through the system, and while it was figured out exactly who they were and what to do with them. And the Labour regime said that it was racist and inhumane, and tried to block it. They blocked all of the flights to Rwanda that the previous Home Secretaries tried to set off. And then eventually, when they got into government, dismantled the scheme altogether and said that they would instead process asylum claims quicker so that they could sort out the backlog. But in reality, all that means is letting more people stay in this country for longer. And in fact, the illegal migration figures have risen since Labour came into power, because now there's absolutely no disincentive to not come illegally to Britain.
Yeah.
It's unconscionable that members of Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs in Britain, who are foreign nationals, Pakistani citizens, are still living in Britain after being convicted of sex crimes. I believe, from my knowledge, there's not a single criminal who has been convicted of being a Pakistani Muslim grooming gang member, convicted of raping, exploiting, murdering little girls in Britain on British soil. Not a single one of them has been deported. And in fact, many of them have been released and are currently living in the same communities that they abused little girls in just a few short years ago.
So do you know what the Labour Party's argument for, like, what's their argument against deporting people who've been convicted of crimes, like illegal immigrants that have been convicted of crimes? Like, what's the downside of deporting those people? They have to have some excuse, right? It's like, we
That it
can't do
violates
it.
their human rights.
Oh
Which
my gosh.
can you imagine saying that it would violate the rights of a person who violated little girls for years, who exploited, murdered, trafficked, sodomized, raped little girls on British soil, who took away their human rights, to say that they are more deserving of protection and support than those little girls were that they abused? That's what the Labour Party says. That's what the Home Office says. That's what politicians say, that it's illegal because it breaches their human rights. There was a case again a couple of months ago where a foreign national who was convicted of raping, I believe it was a 13-year-old girl, was told that he would be allowed to stay in Britain because it would violate his right to a family, his family rights. There was another case of a foreign national who raped his own stepdaughter and was told that it would violate his right to a family life, his human right to a family life, to be deported to his home country. Bear in mind, he had raped the stepdaughter to whom he supposedly had an inalienable human right to a life with. The very same child that he abused was the reason that he was able to stay in this country.
I just can't, like, I can't even wrap my head. I can't understand it at all. It's so, like, it's so evil, but it's also so naive and so stupid. It's like, can people actually be that naive, that level? Like, I can understand from a liberal perspective being like, multiculturalism is only a benefit, like, everybody wants the good of the world, you know, everyone's innately good and they'll all group together and it'll be this beautiful thing. Like, I can understand that was the vision. But once you hear about things, can't you be like, okay, maybe not everyone thinks like me? It's so
Britain is proof that
shocking.
that isn't the case, and it is an insult to suggest that the issue of Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs and in general illegal migration and the level of illegal migrant crime in the UK is a result of anything other than failed multiculturalism and failed integration. I'm the daughter of first generation immigrant myself. I'm biracial. My mother came here in the early 2000s legally as an economic migrant and has paid taxes in the country for 20 odd years, has contributed to society as a British citizen, is proud to be British, and wants the good of society. It is an insult to equate her and her right to be in the country to illegal migrants and malicious foreign actors who come to our country, establish their own way of life, refuse to integrate, refuse to learn English, refuse to be a part of our society, and seek nothing but to dismantle it at its very core, who resent it and criticize it and label British society and British people evil and racist and bigoted, while reaping the benefits of the country that they hate and despise so much.
Oh, 100%. 100%. So how on a government level do places avoid that? Do you think it's almost all illegal immigrants, or is this also a legal immigration problem?
It is
Because
also a
like
legal
I'm
immigration
not
problem.
opposed. Like I know there are a lot of conservatives that are, especially with all the illegal immigration problems that we're
Mm,
having, there are a lot of conservatives that are like, no more immigration, period.
mm,
And that's always been an aspect of conservatism. And
mm.
I was never on board with that because I can see the
No.
benefits of immigration as long as
Yeah.
people are want to come to your country and
Controlled
become,
migration.
yeah, become part of the country. They don't want to
Mm,
bring their country here. Like you want to go to Britain because Britain's beautiful, the people are wonderful, and you want to be British,
yeah.
right? So it's just controlled. Do you think just a lower rate of legal immigration? What do you mean by controlled?
Absolutely. And this is the thing, British conservatism, I would say, has always been more center of right than, for example, American republicanism. It is the British political system is far more left-leaning as a whole
Yeah,
than
for sure. Canada too.
most other Western nations. I think that Britain traditionally has always been a very moderate country. Even British conservatives. I mean, British conservatives, the Conservative Party was the party that legalized gay marriage in 2013. They are broadly aligned in a lot of social issues, for example. But it is definitely a migration problem in general, legal and illegal migration. And Britain was always a case study of the ideal migration model up until about 2008, because up until about 2008, we had a net migration figure of between 60 to 80,000 per year. Last year, I'm pretty sure it was around 450,000 net migration into the country, much of this being illegal, but a lot of it also being legal. The previous Conservative government tried to tighten a lot of the rules on low skilled workers and temporary workers, as I know is happening in Canada right now with the tightening up of the student visa and permanent residency requirements because of the influx of Indian migrants into Canada in the last decade. But in Britain, we always had a very, very tightly controlled and very functional migration system up until about 2008. And since then, migration figures have just built and built and built and are now at an untenable level. And it's due to the ignorance and I think the willful uh, optimism of left-wing parties and even the Conservatives fell victim to this in not wanting to come across as racist, as we see in the Pakistani Muslim grooming gang
Yeah.
scandal, not wanting to be seen as racist, not wanting to be divisive, not wanting to go against the idea of, well, migration is good in general as a whole, because I do believe that migration is good when it's controlled. Controlled migration is good, and economic migration in general is not a bad thing. It's when it's uncontrolled and when it's out of control that it becomes an issue, as we're seeing in Britain. And so now we're at this point where the figures are so high and the system is so broken that governments have no idea how to roll it back and how to claw back control. And when you have a government like Labour in power who are inclined to say that anyone who opposes migration is racist, how exactly are you supposed to challenge that narrative?
Okay, that makes sense to me. I guess to play the devil's advocate, so if this grooming gang situation has been going on since the 70s, that was when immigration was still more controlled, right? So there's still some sort of problem even with, well, what do you think?
I think the social issues have been compounding for decades. It
Yeah.
isn't, it didn't happen overnight. It feels as though it happened a little bit overnight because we're only just seeing the issue come into mainstream global consciousness. But the issue in Britain has been building for decades, and particularly when it comes to the British Pakistani community, these aren't illegal migrants for the most part. These are legal migrants into the country. There is a very large Pakistani community in Britain. Many of them are perfectly respectable, perfectly legal and contributing members of society who are also proud to be British, but there is a very significant population who are not and who do not follow the rule of British law, who believe that they are exempt, who believe that their way of life is fundamentally opposed to British society and that their way of life is correct. And so they've established, as I said, micro communities in areas in Britain and operate under their own rules and regulations, and those in power are too scared to call it out because they don't want to be called racist. And so in Britain, the issue with the British Pakistani community in particular is one of fear and a lack of controlled opposition, or any opposition really, because Britain again is a very tolerant country. It has always been a a very open society, and there is, I mean, it's talked about that Britain is very racist, and that people don't like the people that don't look like them. But I believe it was the ONS and in YouGov, after the most recent census, ran a nationwide poll of about 200,000 respondents asking about their opinions on various social issues, one of them being of race and ethnicity. And it was actually found that Britain was one of the least racist countries when compared to global statistics on migration, and on multiculturalism, and on all of these social issues that we are being told daily we are wrong and extremist and bigoted regarding. And so the social issues in Britain have been compounded due to a false narrative that any opposition to multiculturalism is racist. And so I think that the British Pakistani community in particular has always established a double standard when it comes to their treatment in British society. We don't hear about Christianophobia or Sikhophobia or Hinduophobia. It's always Islamophobia in Britain. It's always that people are bigoted or discriminating against Muslims. When that isn't the case, it's just that that community in particular expects to be treated differently and expects an enhanced level of immunity to the issues that would otherwise in Britain land you in prison, or would be called out by the great and the good. And because of fears of being racist, as again was seen in the Telford report, the Rotherham report, the Rochdale report, was reported as absolutely the cause of child sexual exploitation not being called out by those in power. In Telford, it was said that it was due to nervousness about race. It has been allowed to happen for so long and compound and build because those in power were too scared of being called racist to call out those communities who were failing to uphold their British values and duties.
Wild. Okay. Well, Samantha, if people want to keep up with you, where should they go online? Is there anywhere you recommend to read more about this, or at least we should know your social media handles? I'll also link them in the description for anybody listening.
Yes, I am on Twitter, on X, sorry, it's still in my brain that it's Twitter, but I'm on X under @Samantha Taghoy. And I also write, as I said, for the Daily Mail, Telegraph, the Spectator, and I do political analysis and commentary on various national news channels. So if you search Samantha Smith on YouTube, I'll come up. I might be the third or fourth result, but you'll find my interviews and my stuff pretty easily on there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming on and talking about this. Sorry that you went through everything you went through. That's terrible. I'm really glad you're still talking about it and trying to, warn people and implement change. It's really important. So hopefully something good comes of it. So thanks again for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for bringing this to attention when you had no duty to. It's funny how it seems like North Americans are the ones who are fighting for us more than our government and our politicians ever did. So thank you very much.
Yeah, well, it should make anybody sane unbelievably angry. I feel like if that's not your response, then there's something wrong. Like you can't look at I might actually link some of the X posts so people can see what I mean by transcripts, so people know so people get a better idea of how awful this is. So I'll put those in the description, because anyone who reads those and isn't like appalled morally to a soul level, there's something wrong.
Absolutely. And, obviously you can only say certain things on YouTube without getting demonetized and flagged. But if you read the transcripts, if you thought of the age of the victims and the girls who were abused, again, think of your daughter, your granddaughter, your sister at that age. And if you think of the level of torture and the atrocities that were committed against little girls in Britain, and the stories that those in power were turning a blind eye to, it would churn any sane person's stomach.
Agreed. Well, hopefully this was useful to people. Thank you, Samantha, again for coming on. That was very informative.